My name is HauntedFears, and tonight you're stepping onto ground that doesn't want you here. 4. Most disturbing true. Haunted trails in Utah's Arches and Red Rock country. Welcome back, HauntedFears horror family. Out in Utah's endless red deserts, past the pretty overlooks and crowded viewpoints, there are trails that don't show up in glossy brochures. These are paths where time doesn't move the way it should, where the wind carries voices that seem to know your name, and where the red rock feels like it's watching every step you take. These aren't the places tourists brag about visiting. These are the stretches of sand and stone locales only talk about in low voices, late at night, when they're sure no one else is listening. Tonight, you're going to hear from people who went out there alone and came back different. People who saw themselves standing on the trail ahead, who lost hours or even days they can't explain. As you listen, pay attention to the room around you. That small sound behind you, that shift in the air, that shadow that wasn't there a moment ago. If you make it to the end of this video, prove you're not alone out there. Drop a like, subscribe, and share this with someone who thinks they're brave enough to walk these trails in the dark. Welcome to HauntedFears. I thought I was alone on that trail until I saw myself sitting up ahead, watching me like I'd been there the whole time. By the time I realized what I was looking at, it was already too late to pretend nothing was wrong. My name is Noah Rivera, and I've spent most of my adult life chasing light. Not metaphorically either. I'm a landscape photographer from San Francisco. I've built my portfolio on those fleeting seconds when the sun hits rock or water at just the right angle and turns it into something that doesn't look real. Utah had always been on my list, and Arches National Park was one of those places I kept seeing in other people's work and telling myself, I'll get there next year. Last October, I finally ran out of excuses and booked the trip. By the time I drove into the park that afternoon, I had my plan dialed in. Devil's Garden Trail for the evening, landscape arch at golden hour, then maybe a few blue hour shots if the clouds cooperated. The air was dry and cool when I pulled into the parking lot, a little wind pushing fine red dust across the pavement like smoke. There were plenty of cars, but not the madhouse you get in peak summer. I checked my watch, 3:02 p.m., and that felt perfect. Enough time to get in, scout, and set up. I remember locking the car and taking a quick inventory. Camera, 2 lenses, tripod, 2 liters of water, trail map folded in the side pocket of my pack. I've done this enough that everything is muscle memory. The sky was that washed-out pale blue you get before the color starts. The sandstone around the lot glowed a kind of dull orange. I knew in a few hours it would be burning. Devil's Garden has this way of easing you in. The first section is so easy and well-trodden that you almost forget you're in the desert. I walked past families coming back the other way, kids stumbling in the sand, people in white sneakers and sun hats, and rental RV wristbands. Everyone has that same look, red dust on their legs, hair blown out, eyes a little too wide from being in open space all day. They all look normal. I felt normal. It wasn't until I passed Landscape Arch and started toward Double O Arch that things shifted. The crowds thin out once you go beyond the main viewpoint. The trail gets rougher, and a lot of people turn back there. I remember feeling good about that, actually. Fewer people to work around meant cleaner compositions. The sun had dropped just enough that the color on the rock was starting to get deeper. My watch read a little after 4. The light felt right for where the sun was in the sky. Somewhere on the stretch toward Double O, the sense of time started to loosen, and I didn't notice it right away. I was focused on the way the shadows were stretching, long and sharp, like someone had taken a knife to the landscape. The wind would gust every few minutes, then stop dead. Between gusts, there was a silence that felt almost physical, like the air thickened. I don't remember a single moment where it hit me. It was more like an accumulation of small, wrong things. First, I realized I hadn't seen another person in at least 20 minutes. That's unusual even in shoulder season. Then I noticed my shadow on the sandstone didn't seem to be lined up with the direction of the sun, just slightly off, like the light source had nudged a few degrees without the sun actually moving. I stopped and checked my watch. 4:47 p.m. I remember that number clearly because it's burned into my brain now. It made sense for how long I felt like I'd been hiking. But when I pulled my phone out to check the time there, the lock screen said 6:32 p.m. I did that thing everyone does when something doesn't add up. You assume it's you. I thought maybe I misread my watch, so I checked it again. Still 4:47. I checked the phone again, thinking maybe it was still on California time. It wasn't. The phone was synced to local time, and it insisted I'd somehow lost almost 2 hours on a trail I'd been consciously walking the whole time. I laughed just once, one of those dry, forced laughs. The sound bounced off the rock in a way I didn't like. The echo came back slower than it should have, like it was traveling farther than the walls around me suggested. I told myself I'd deal with the time thing later. Photographers are obsessive about light, not clocks. Maybe my brain had just dropped into that focused state where everything else slides into the background. It happens. I put the phone away and kept walking. The vertigo started as a subtle tilt. I paused on a section of slick rock, and the horizon looked like it had been tilted a few degrees to the left. I blinked, looked away, looked back. Same tilt. The ground itself felt level under my boots. My inner ear was telling me one thing, my eyes another. I knew Double O Arch was close. The trail markers were there. The rock formations around me matched both the map and the photos I'd studied beforehand. I wasn't lost. That was the worst part. Everything matched, and still something was off. That's when I saw him. There's a section before you drop into the area near Double O where the trail curves around a large rock outcrop. As I came around that bend, I saw a figure sitting on a flat rock about 50 yards ahead, where the trail narrowed between two slender fins of sandstone. He had his pack next to him, one knee up, one arm resting on it. He was turned slightly away from me at first, so I caught the shape of him before the details. My first thought was just, oh, another hiker. I was almost relieved. The silence was starting to feel too heavy. Then I noticed the color of his jacket. It was the same muted green I was wearing. Not a common shade either. Not that bright REI green everyone has. This was a faded olive color from a brand that doesn't make that exact model anymore. The same patch spot on the left elbow where I'd torn it on a branch 2 winters ago. My brain immediately went into explanation mode. People buy the same gear. Faded green is common. Maybe he tore his elbow on something too. The world has coincidences. I kept walking toward him, boots scuffing in the sand. As I got closer, I noticed his backpack. Same brand as mine, same color, same straps, same little white scuff mark on the right side where airport security had dragged it across a concrete floor in Denver. My mouth went dry so fast I could taste dust. He turned his head a fraction more, and I saw the profile of his face. It was my face. Not in the vague way where someone kind of looks like you. I'm talking about the exact same line of the jaw, the same way my hair curls a bit over my ears when it needs a cut, the same small scar at the edge of my eyebrow from when I fell off my bike at 8 years old. He was me, sitting on that rock like he'd been waiting for me to come around that bend. I stopped dead. The air around me felt suddenly colder, like I'd stepped from sunlight into a walk-in freezer. My heartbeat sounded too loud in my ears. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't jump or flinch. He just watched me with this exhausted expression, like someone at the end of a very long day who already knows how the conversation is going to go. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time felt strange again, stretchy and thin. The shadows around us were long, too long for what both my watch and the sky were telling me about the hour. I had the instinct to call out, to say something like, "Hey," or "What the hell is this?" But my throat locked up. He stood. The motion was wrong. Not jerky or supernatural, just off. like my body moving from outside of my own sense of timing. He got to his feet in one smooth motion, swung his pack over his shoulder, and without breaking eye contact for more than a second, he turned and stepped between the two fins of rock to his right. Here's the thing. I knew, with absolute certainty, there was no side slot there. I had looked at maps, photos, even trail reports. That section of trail had solid rock walls on that side. People don't just slip into a side canyon that doesn't exist, but he did. He walked into a narrow slit in the rock, like someone had drawn a line with a knife where there hadn't been one before, and then he was gone. I should have turned around. I know that. I knew it then. Any sensible person would have, but there's something about seeing yourself where you're not supposed to be that short-circuits reason. Curiosity is a powerful, stupid thing. I walked toward the gap. As I got closer, the air temperature dropped another few degrees. Not a breeze, not shade, just an abrupt change, like crossing an invisible boundary. The light on the rock shifted too. The oranges deepened, but the shadows on the ground near my feet stretched in directions that didn't line up with where the sun sat in the sky. The smell in the air changed from dry dust to something like wet stone, like the inside of a cave after rain. The slot wasn't large, just wide enough for one person with a pack to slip through sideways. It hadn't been there a minute earlier. Still, there it was, a thin, vertical wound in the sandstone. I stepped through. For a moment, everything went quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get out in the desert with distance between sounds, but a suffocating, heavy silence. No wind, no distant voices, no crunch of gravel. Even my own footsteps sounded muted, like I was walking on thick carpet instead of sand and rock. The slot opened into a small enclosed space, almost like a shallow room naturally carved into the rock. The light was dimmer here, filtered in from a crack above that I couldn't quite see. It had that weird quality of light you get just before a storm, except there were no clouds in the sky outside. On the ground in front of me sat a camera bag. My camera bag. Same model. Same scratch zipper pull, same little sewn-on patch I'd added in college. I felt a kind of floating disconnect, like my body and my thoughts had separated. I already knew what I would find if I opened it, and I also knew I was going to open it anyway. My hands didn't feel like they belonged to me as I knelt down and unzipped the bag. Inside, everything was arranged exactly how I would have packed it. Camera body, lenses, cleaning cloth. Except there was something else, too. 3 rolls of 35mm film, rubber banded together. I recognized the brand and the faded handwriting on the cardboard canisters immediately. It was mine. My handwriting. Each roll labeled with dates from 3 years earlier from a trip I'd taken to Big Sur. I remembered shooting those rolls. I remembered developing them. Those negatives were in a box back in my apartment in San Francisco. They couldn't be here, in Utah, in a bag that was also already on my shoulder. I picked one up. The ink from the label smudged just slightly under my thumb, like it had been written recently, not years ago. The desert air in that little rock room smelled like wet pavement and darkroom chemicals, even though there was no water, no chemicals, no anything. My chest tightened. The edges of my vision felt fuzzy, like I was about to pass out. I backed up until I hit the rock wall behind me and slid down until I was sitting, bag in front of me, film in my hand. I don't know how long I sat there. I remember closing my eyes because the light felt wrong, like it was pressing against my eyelids instead of filtering through them. I remember my breathing getting loud and rough in that enclosed space. My heartbeat slowed, then sped up, then settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. When I opened my eyes again, everything had changed. The light was different. Softer, colder. I could see a strip of sky through the crack above, and it was no longer the saturated orange of evening. It was washed-out blue, the kind of pale blue you only get right after dawn. Shadows in. The little room had shifted, shorter and angled differently. I stood up, legs stiff and tingling as if I'd been in the same position for hours. I stepped back through the slot, and onto the main trail, blinking against the sudden brightness. The landscape outside looked the same arches in the distance, same curves of sandstone. But the color of the light said morning, not evening. I checked my watch. 6:08 a.m. I actually laughed, a weak, shaky sound. That had to be wrong. My watch hadn't changed out here before, but maybe it had reset somehow. I pulled my phone out, hands trembling enough that I almost dropped it. 6:08 a.m. Same as the watch. The date was the next day. I stood there, alone, on Devil's Garden Trail, in the early morning of a day I didn't remember living through. I hadn't been tired before I went into that slot. Now my body felt like I'd hiked for 12 hours straight. I didn't run. Running didn't even occur to me. The fear I felt wasn't the sharp, panicked kind that makes you bolt. It was a heavy, grounded dread that settled in my bones. I walked out slowly, one foot in front of the other, listening to my own footsteps scrape and crunch on the sand. Only they didn't sound quite right. There's a certain rhythm to your own steps. You know it subconsciously. As I moved, I heard that rhythm, but every now and then there was an extra scrape, one half beat off, like footsteps that weren't mine trying to match my pace from somewhere just ahead. When I stopped, the echoes took a fraction of a second too long to fade, like they were coming back from farther away than the terrain allowed. I made it back to the parking lot without seeing a single other person. The lot looked different, with only a few cars scattered around, the lights sharp and new. My car was exactly where I'd left it. The paint looked frost-dulled, though it hadn't felt cold enough for frost. I tossed my pack into the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. The thought of starting the car and driving away felt surreal, like I was breaking some kind of rule. At some point, curiosity beat out fear, just enough for me to dig into the side pocket of my pack for the trail map. I wanted to see if Devil's Garden had any unmarked side canyons or maintenance access points where that slot could have been. The map was there, folded the same way I always folded them, creases lined up neatly. When I unfolded it, a smaller, tighter fold fell out and landed in my lap, a scrap of the same paper torn from one corner. My heart was already thudding before I opened it. The handwriting was mine, no question. Same slant, same pressure, same little inconsistent curve on certain letters. The ink looked fresh. 3 words, written in a shaky line that trailed off at the end. Don't follow yourself next time. I stared at that sentence until the edges of the letters blurred. The phrase, next time, sat there, like a physical weight. It implied something I didn't want to think about, that this had happened before, or would happen again, or was happening in loops I wasn't aware of. I drove back to town on autopilot. I don't remember the turns, the exit from the park, the check-in at the motel. I just remember catching my reflection in the bathroom mirror that night and flinching hard enough that I knocked my toothbrush off the sink. My own face looked wrong to me. Not in any specific way I could point to, but in the same way my shadow had looked wrong on the trail, slightly misaligned, slightly delayed. When I got home to San Francisco, I boxed up all my camera gear. Every body, every lens, every strap. I sold some, shoved the rest in the back of a closet. Friends asked why. I told them I was burned out, that I wanted to try something new. The real reason is simpler and harder to admit. Out there on Devil's Garden Trail, I saw a version of myself that had already made choices I don't remember making. I walked into a space that shouldn't exist, carrying film I'd shot years before, and lost a night that no amount of sleep ever seems to give back. Now, every time I catch my reflection in a window or a mirror, there's a split second where I can't shake the feeling that I'm not the one who walked back out of that slot. And I don't ever want to know what happens if I follow myself again. My name is Lauren Bishop, and I make a living convincing people to go places alone. Solo-friendly hikes, quiet sunrise spots, hidden arches you can visit without the crowds. That's my niche. I've built a decent following on the idea that with the right prep and the right mindset, You don't have to be afraid of being out there by yourself. I still believe that mostly, but I will never say that about Corona Arch again. That morning in March, I pulled into the dirt parking area while it was still blue dark, about half an hour before sunrise. The air had that sharp edge it only gets in the desert before the sun comes up, clean and cold in a way that wakes you up better than coffee. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, listening to the ticking of the cooling car, the silence of everything else. No other vehicles, perfect for a secret sunrise arch video. I laced my boots, shrugged on my pack, and stepped out into the chill. Gravel crunched under my soles as I crossed toward the trail sign. The sky was starting to lighten at the edges, that faint gray-blue gradient just before color shows up. I could see my breath in thin ghosts in front of me. Corona Arch Trail isn't complicated. It's about 3 miles round trip, not in the national park, and considered moderate, which, in Utah terms, means don't do this in flip-flops. I'd read the usual warnings about the slick rock sections and the cable-assisted climb, but it all looked straightforward on paper. I signed the trail register out of habit, wrote the time, 6:27 a.m., and started walking. The first stretch was easy. Sandy path, low scrub on either side, distant silhouettes of red rock against the brightening sky. My footsteps made that satisfying crunch-crunch sound on the grit. Every time I inhaled, I got a mix of cold air and the faint mineral smell of the desert. Somewhere overhead, a raven called once, then went quiet. I saw her maybe 5 minutes in. At first she was just a shape on the trail ahead, a darker cutout against the lighter rock. I noticed the outline of a backpack, the swinging motion of arms. My immediate thought was mild annoyance, not because someone else was out there, but because I'd hoped to have the arch to myself for a few minutes, at least for the intro and some shots. As the distance between us settled, I realized something was off about what she was wearing. The clothes looked wrong for now. High-waisted hiking pants, a bulky jacket with an old-fashioned cut, a bandana tied around her hair. The color palette was all muted browns and faded oranges, the kind of gear you see in vintage outdoor catalogs from the 1970s. Even her pack had that old rectangular frame look to it. I slowed down a little, expecting the gap between us to close naturally. It didn't. She stayed exactly where she was, a fixed distance ahead, close enough that I could make out broad details, too far to see her face. When I sped up, she sped up. When I eased off, she eased off. I told myself it was just one of those trail illusions, a trick of perspective. Paths can do that. I know that. I tell my audience that all the time. But as the minutes passed, the feeling that I was following someone rather than just sharing the same route grew heavier. There's a section where you cross the old railroad line and then start up toward the rock. By then, the sky was turning that pastel gradient of early morning, pink and pale gold on the horizon. The air stayed crisp, but I'd worked up enough warmth that my gloves were stuffed into a side pocket. My boots scraped over rock, sand giving way to sandstone slabs. She was still ahead of me. I told myself if I kept a steady pace, I'd catch up with her at the cable section, maybe offer a quick hello, make a comment about the cold, get something normal out of this. People dress weird sometimes. Maybe she was into retro gear. Maybe she was filming something too. The closer we got to the steeper part, the more aware I became of the sound of my own steps. On sand, you expect crunch. On slick rock, more of a scuff. It took me a while to realize that my ears were telling me something my brain didn't want to process. The rhythm under my feet felt slightly out of sync with the rhythm I was hearing. It was like there were 2 sets of footsteps, mine, and an echo that wasn't acting like an echo. When I hesitated, the sound hesitated half a beat too late. When I sped up, it stayed just off, like the world was trying and failing to mimic me. The cable section came into view ahead, a slab of inclined slick rock with a metal cable bolted into the rock for balance. I watched her reach it first. She never touched the cable. She didn't pause, didn't lean into the angle like you naturally do walking up something that steep. Her posture stayed perfectly upright, as if the slab were level ground. Her boots, dark, scuffed, with a rounded old-school shape, landed on the rock in a way that didn't quite match the incline. She just walked up, smooth and unbothered, while my thighs were already anticipating the burn. I swallowed and adjusted my pack straps, suddenly very aware of the weight. When it was my turn, I grabbed the cable without hesitation. The rock was cold against my palms, sandy in places where other boots had ground dust into it. I used my hands, knees slightly bent, feeling the pull of gravity on my calves. This was real. This was how bodies act on sloped stone. At the top, I looked ahead for her, expecting at least a glimpse of movement, a flash of her jacket as she rounded a bend. She was exactly the same distance ahead as before. No panting, no stopping to catch her breath. Just that steady, unhurried pace, like she had all the time in the world and none of the physical limitations the rest of us have. The trail curved and wound around domes of rock, views opening and closing. The sky was warming in color now, a deeper gold near the horizon. My fingers felt a little numb, even though I wasn't that cold. I thought about calling out, "Hey," just to break the pattern. But something about the back of her head, the angle of her neck, made my throat close up. It sounds stupid, but I felt like if I heard her voice, it would cement something I didn't want to admit yet. The last stretch to Corona Arch is beautiful in that unreal Utah way. The land opens up, and you see the arch from a distance, this massive sandstone curve hanging against sky. I've seen a lot of arches, but Corona has a weight to it, a kind of presence that doesn't translate in photos. She reached the viewing area first. There's a natural flat space where people usually stop to take pictures, set up tripods, sit and stare. She walked right up near the edge, where the rock drops off into open space. Her silhouette was sharp against the brightening sky. Her clothes a patchwork of faded oranges and browns. I slowed without meaning to, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air felt denser here, like there was more of it pressing against my skin. A faint, hollow wind tone moved through the arch, almost musical, low and droning. It reminded me of the sound you get blowing across the top of a glass bottle, if the bottle were the size of a house. As I approached, I blinked. In that blink, she moved. One moment she was ahead of me, back turned, facing the drop. The next, I felt breath at my ear. Warm, close, unmistakably human. "You're wearing my boots." The voice was soft but clear, female, with a slight rasp. It was right behind me, not ahead. Not echoing off rock, directly at my ear, close enough that the tiny hairs on my neck rose in a line. Every muscle in my body locked. For a second, I couldn't even breathe. My mind did this weird double exposure thing. Part of me still picturing her at the edge, part of me feeling her behind me. Slowly, like I was underwater, I forced my eyes down. The boots on my feet were not the ones I had laced up at the car. The modern, gray and blue trail runners I'd walked in on were gone. In their place were heavy leather boots, darkened with age and use. The laces were ragged and mismatched. The leather was cracked at the bend of the toes. Scuffs and gouges ran along the sides. There were stains around the seams, dark and uneven, the kind of discoloration leather gets when it's been wet with something thicker than water. My stomach lurched. I tried to tell myself it was a trick, a brain misfiring under stress. But when I shifted my weight, I could feel the stiffness of old leather around my ankles. The boots didn't move like my own. They felt heavier, like I was standing in someone else's stance. A hand settled on my shoulder. The weight of it was undeniable. Fingers through the fabric of my jacket, solid and real. The grip wasn't tight, but it was possessive, like the way someone might hold onto a bag they don't want to drop. The smell hit me, then old leather and something metallic, a faint coppery tang, like pennies and dried blood. Everything went black, not a slow fade. 1 second I was staring at those boots, feeling that hand, hearing the wind hum through the arch. The next, there was nothing. No falling sensation, no dream visuals, no thoughts. Just a complete absence of experience, like someone cut film out of a reel. When the world came back, it did it all at once. I was on my back on rough ground, gravel pressing into my shoulder blades. Sunlight was bright and high, not soft and low. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. I blinked up at a washed-out blue sky, then at a face leaning over me, creased, sunburned, worried. "Hey, you with me?" I didn't know the voice. My brain scrambled for recognition and found none. I tried to sit up and felt hands help me, steadying me from behind. My head throbbed like I'd slept wrong for days. "You gave us a scare," the person said. "You know how long you've been out here?" I croaked something that was supposed to be no. It came out as a dry rasp. 3 days, they said. "You were reported missing." 3 days. The words felt like they belonged in someone else's story. My last solid memory was standing under Corona Arch at sunrise. Now the sun was overhead, and dirt parking, trucks, and a ranger with a radio had replaced the arch and the hum of the wind. I looked down at my feet. My own boots were back, gray and blue, dusted with red sand, laces tied in the way I always double-knotted them. No leather, no stains. They got me water, asked the usual questions, name, date, where I was from, what I remembered. I answered what I could, which wasn't much. I said I started the trail early. I said I saw someone ahead of me. I didn't mention the boots. I didn't mention the voice. Watching the ranger's face as I tried to piece it together, I knew how it would sound. Later, back home, I did what I always do. Research. I told myself I was looking for interesting historical angles for the video. Really, I was looking for anything that could make what happened feel less like a mental break. It didn't take long. Corona Arch, 1970s. A brief article, grainy black and white photo. A woman in her 20s, hiking alone, fell to her death near the arch. Witnesses reported seeing her near the edge shortly after sunrise. Details were sparse. The only line that made my heart drop was a throwaway description. She was last seen wearing brown leather hiking boots. I stared at that sentence for a long time. The boots I wore on that trip, the real ones, I never put them on again. I didn't donate them. I didn't sell them. I took them out to a fire pit behind a friend's place a week later, poured lighter fluid on them, and burned them until the rubber melted and the leather turned black and then gray. The smell made me gag, acrid and chemical. People online still ask me, sometimes, why I don't do solo, hike content the way I used to. I give vague answers, more safety conscious now, testing a new direction, focusing on community-based experiences. I film with others. I keep someone in frame. What I don't say is this. There is a 3-day hole in my memory that nothing has filled. No dreams, no flashes, no fragments. It's just gone, like someone edited it out. And sometimes, when I'm walking on a trail alone, even just a local one near home, I feel my steps fall out of sync with the sound they make, like my heels are landing in someone else's prints. And every now and then, on cold mornings, I swear I can smell old leather and that faint copper scent, even when I'm barefoot in my apartment, nowhere near red rock or arches or the edge of anything. My name is Eric Salazar, and I've been a ranger with the Bureau of Land Management for 15 years. I know the desert. I know heat, dust, dehydration, and the 100 small ways the wilderness tries to kill people who don't respect it. I've pulled lost hikers out of slot canyons, treated snake bites in the field, and talked down panicked tourists who thought they were going to die because they ran out of water half a mile from the trailhead. The desert doesn't scare me. Or it didn't, until that afternoon in the fiery furnace. It was late July, pushing toward evening, but still hot enough that my shirt stuck to my back the second I stepped out of the air-conditioned truck. The thermometer on my dash read 104 degrees, standard summer in southern Utah. I'd gotten a radio call earlier that day about possible vandalism in the furnace. Fresh markings on rock, maybe some off-route foot traffic. It's a sensitive area, permit only, and we take that seriously. I grabbed my pack, clipped my radio on, and headed in. The fiery furnace isn't a trail in the normal sense. It's a maze, narrow corridors of sandstone that twist and turn and dead end without warning. Even people with permits get turned around in there. I've led guided hikes through it dozens of times. I know which fins of rock to stay left of, where the pour-offs are, which tight squeezes open up and which ones don't. I could navigate it half asleep. That confidence is probably what made me careless. The first 20 minutes were routine. The rock around me glowed that deep burnt orange color it gets in the late afternoon, shadows starting to stretch long and cool between the walls. The air was thick, hard to pull into your lungs, but that's normal when you're down in the corridors with no airflow. I moved carefully, stepping over loose rock, keeping my bearings. The heat pressed down from above and radiated up from the stone under my boots. I found the petroglyphs about 30 minutes in. They were on a section of wall I'd walked past 100 times, smooth Navajo sandstone that catches light in a way people love to photograph. Now there were figures carved into it, or something like carving. The lines looked fresh, the exposed rock lighter than the desert varnished surface around them. But the style was old, really old. Anthropomorphic shapes, simplified and blocky, the kind you see in genuine indigenous rock art that's been there for centuries. Except these figures didn't have heads. 5 of them spread across the wall in a rough line. Each one had a torso, arms, legs, no heads. Just flat shoulders, where the neck should start. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of it. Vandalism, sure, but why mimic that style so carefully? And how had someone done this without leaving more obvious tool marks? Then I saw the 6th figure. It was off to the right, slightly separated from the others. This one had a head. It also had details the others didn't. A suggestion of clothing, a belt line, something that looked like a radio on the hip. The proportions were rough, but the more I looked, the more I felt a cold, prickling sensation crawl up the back of my neck. It looked like me. Not in any fine detail way, just the posture, the gear distribution, the shape. It was the kind of resemblance that hits you in the gut before your brain can talk you out of it. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Not the usual desert quiet where wind whistles over rock or lizards skitter through gravel. This was a heavier silence, like the air itself had thickened into something that absorbed sound instead of carrying it. The corridor started to feel wrong after that. I know the fiery furnace. I know it the way you know the layout of your own house in the dark. But as I moved deeper, checking for other signs of disturbance, the maze felt like it was shifting. Not physically. The rock didn't move. But the spaces between felt different. Narrower in some places, wider in others. Walls that should have been vertical seemed to lean inward, just slightly, just enough to make my depth perception stumble. I put my hand on the stone to steady myself, and it felt warm. Not sun-warm. Warm, like skin. The texture under my palm seemed to shift slightly, expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic way. I pulled my hand back fast and stared at the rock face. It looked solid, motionless, but I could swear I'd felt it breathe. I kept moving, telling myself it was heat exhaustion playing tricks. I'd seen people hallucinate in temperatures like this. Rational explanations. That's what I held on to. Then I saw the shadow. It was cast on the canyon wall ahead of me, a human silhouette in the angled evening light. Except the shadow wasn't moving. I was walking forward, but the shadow stayed perfectly still, frozen mid-step on the rock face like a photograph. I stopped. The shadow stayed where it was. I took 2 more steps. The shadow didn't shift, didn't lengthen, or shorten the way shadows do when you move. It just hung there on the stone, disconnected from any source. My mouth went dry. I looked around for what could be casting it. Another hiker. A rock formation shaped like a person. Anything. There was nothing. Just me, alone in the corridor, in a shadow that wasn't behaving the way physics said it should. I moved past it quickly, forcing myself not to look back. The next section of the maze opened into a slightly wider area, still enclosed by towering sandstone fins on all sides. The light here was dimmer, filtered through narrow gaps above. The air smelled wrong. The usual dry dust scent mixed with something faintly sweet and organic, like sun-baked fruit left to rot. That's when I saw the uniform. It was wedged under a pile of sandstone slabs in the back corner of the alcove, rocks that looked like they'd fallen from above in some ancient rockfall. At first, I thought it was just fabric trash, something a careless hiker had left behind. But as I got closer, the details became clearer. It was a ranger shirt, BLM issue, same style as the one I was wearing. The fabric was sun-bleached almost to gray, rotted through in places where the desert had eaten away at it. The sleeves were shredded. It looked like it had been there for years, maybe decades. On the chest, just visible under the edge of a rock slab, was a name tag. Salazar. My name. I crouched down slowly, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct told me to back away, to leave this place and never come back. But I couldn't stop staring. Same uniform style, same shoulder patches, same name stitched onto the chest. The only difference was the condition. This one had been abandoned here long enough to decay. Then I noticed something else. There was a tear in the fabric along the right side, just below the ribs, 3 inches long, ragged at the edges, like it had been ripped on something sharp. I looked down at my own shirt. The same tear was there, fresh, clean-edged, in the exact same spot. I hadn't torn my shirt coming in. I'd checked my gear at the truck. It hadn't been there 30 minutes ago. But now it was, matching the rotted uniform under the rock stitch for stitch. The walls around me felt like they were closing in. The air got heavier, harder to breathe. The sweet rotten smell intensified until I had to fight the urge to gag. My hands were shaking as I stood up and backed away from the uniform, from my name, from the tear that shouldn't exist. I needed out. Not just out of that alcove, out of the furnace entirely. I turned and started moving fast, retracing my route by memory. Left at the tall fin, squeezed through the narrow section, right where the corridor splits. I knew the path. I'd walked it dozens of times, except nothing looked right. The corridor I thought led back to the entrance opened into a dead end, solid rock where I remembered open passage. I backtracked, tried another route, another dead end. The maze was wrong. Not subtly wrong, fundamentally wrong, like someone had rearranged the layout while I wasn't looking. My training kicked in. When you're lost, you stop. You assess. You don't panic. I pulled out my map and compass, forced myself to breathe steadily. The compass needle spun lazily, couldn't settle on a direction. I tapped it. Still spinning. Useless. I tried the radio. Static. I adjusted the frequency. Tried again. More static, with a faint crackling underneath that almost sounded like words, but too distorted to make out. I was on my own. I started navigating by instinct instead of memory, following the slight downhill grade, the cooler pockets of air, the direction where the light seemed fractionally brighter. I climbed over boulders I didn't remember being there, squeezed through gaps that felt tighter than they should. The rocks stayed warm under my hands the entire time. That same skin-warm temperature, pulsing faintly like something alive. Every surface I touched felt wrong. Too smooth in some places, too rough in others. The sandstone had a tackiness to it, almost like it was damp, even though there was no water anywhere in this desert heat. When I pulled my hand away from one wall, I swore I saw the faint impression of my palm pressed into the stone, as if the rock had given slightly under pressure. When I looked again, the impression was gone. I kept moving, refusing to stop, refusing to think too hard about what I was seeing. Forward motion. That was all that mattered. At one point, I came around a bend and saw myself. Not a person, not another hiker. Just me, exactly as I looked in that moment. Dusty uniform, pack on my shoulders. The same expression of controlled fear on my face, but it wasn't a reflection. It was a petroglyph, carved into the stone with the same ancient style as the headless figures I'd seen earlier. Fresh lines, exposed rock, my exact face rendered in simplified strokes. I didn't stop to examine it. I kept walking. The maze went on and on. Corridors that should have opened to the exit led to more corridors. I lost track of how many turns I made, how many dead ends I hit. The light above was fading fast, the shadows deepening. Soon it would be full dark, and I'd be stuck in here overnight with no way out. Then finally, I saw open space ahead. Not another enclosed corridor, but actual sky, wide and unobstructed. I stumbled toward it, legs aching, throat raw, from breathing hard in the dry heat. I came out into the open air just as the last light was draining from the sky. The parking area was a quarter-mile away, my truck a small shape in the distance. I'd made it. I didn't remember the walk back to the truck. I was moving on autopilot, body doing what it needed to do while my mind tried to process what had just happened. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there in the driver's seat for a long time, hands still shaking. I looked down at my shirt. The tear was still there, just below my ribs. I touched it gently, felt the ragged edges of the fabric. Real, not imagined. I drove back to the ranger station, filed a report that mentioned the petroglyphs but left out most of the rest. Possible vandalism. Recommend follow-up, standard procedure. I didn't mention the uniform with my name on it. I didn't mention the shadow that wouldn't move or the rock that felt like it was breathing. The next morning, I requested a transfer. My supervisor asked why. I told him I was ready for a change, needed something different. He didn't push. I never went back to the fiery furnace. I never told anyone what I found in there, what I saw carved into stone, my own face, my own uniform rotting under rocks that might have been there for decades. 6 months later, my wife left. She said I'd changed. She was right. I couldn't explain to her why I'd wake up in the middle of the night checking the shirt I'd worn that day, looking for tears that shouldn't be there. I couldn't tell her about the feeling that had settled into my bones, the certainty that the furnace had shown me something I wasn't supposed to see. I don't work in Arches anymore. I took a desk job in a different district, far from red rock and sandstone mazes. But every now and then, when I'm getting dressed in the morning, I catch myself checking that spot below my ribs. The tear never got bigger. It never healed. It's just there, waiting. And I know, deep in a part of myself I don't like to acknowledge, that one day I'm going to end up back in that maze. Not because I want to, not because I choose to, but because the furnace showed me a version of myself that already made that choice. And I'm just waiting to catch up too. My name is Dr. Kelly Monroe, though at 25, the doctor part still feels like it belongs to someone older and more confident than I am. I'm a geology grad student at the University of Utah, 3 years into a thesis on Entrada sandstone formation patterns in the Colorado Plateau. Most people think geology is about rocks. It is, technically. But really it's about time, deep time. The kind that makes human lifespans look like camera flashes in the dark. I've always found that perspective comforting. Rocks don't care about your deadlines, or your funding, or whether your advisor likes your latest draft. They just exist, solid and indifferent. That mindset served me well until Tower Arch. It was mid-May, the kind of spring morning in Utah where the air still has a cool edge, but you know by noon it'll be baking. I'd driven out to the Klondike Bluffs area before dawn, wanting to get to the trailhead early and have the place to myself. Tower Arch sits in a remote section of Arches National Park, far enough from the main corridor that most tourists skip it. That's exactly why I picked it. Fewer people meant more time to work undisturbed, more chances to find good sample sites without someone asking what I was doing, or stepping into my photos for scale reference. The parking area was empty when I arrived. Not another car in sight. Perfect. I pulled on my pack, already loaded with sample bags, a small hammer, my field notebook, and 3 liters of water, and started up the trail. Tower Arch Trail isn't long, maybe 3 miles round trip, but it's got enough elevation change and rough terrain that it filters out the casual crowd. The path winds through low desert scrub at first, then starts climbing over slick rock and around tall fins of Entrada sandstone, the same formation I was there to study. The rock in this area is a deep red-orange, layered and cross-bedded in patterns that tell stories of ancient sand dunes that turned to stone over millions of years. The morning light hit it just right, highlighting the texture and color in a way that made me stop every few minutes to take notes. I wasn't just there to collect samples. I was documenting the context, the environment, the way the rock sat in the landscape. Good fieldwork is about seeing the whole picture, not just the pieces you take home. By the time I reached the area near Tower Arch, I'd been hiking for about 45 minutes. The arch itself is impressive. A massive span of sandstone standing alone against the sky, shaped by wind and water over millennia. I set my pack down near a flat section of exposed bedrock and pulled out my tools. The quiet hit me first. Not just quiet. Silence. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of traffic or airplane engines. Just my own breathing and the faint scrape of my boots on stone. I've spent a lot of time in remote places, and silence is normal out there. But this felt different. Heavier. Like the air itself was holding still, waiting. I shook it off and got to work. I was there to sample cross-bedding patterns in the Entrada formation, looking for variations that might indicate different depositional environments. I found a good exposure, clean and unweathered, and used my hammer to carefully chip away a few small pieces, each one labeled and bagged with precise location notes. The work was methodical, almost meditative. I lost track of time. Then I heard the laughter. It was faint at first, distant enough that I thought it might be wind moving through the arch in some weird acoustic way. But as I paused and listened, it resolved into something unmistakable. Children laughing. Not one child. Multiple voices, high and bright, the kind of sound you hear on playgrounds or in parks. I stood up and looked around. The trail behind me was empty. No movement, no color, no sign of people. I scanned the area around the arch. Nothing. The parking lot had been empty when I arrived, and I hadn't passed anyone on the way up. There was no logical reason for children to be out here. I told myself it was an acoustic trick, sound bouncing off rock in unexpected ways. Maybe hikers on a different trail entirely, their voices carried by some quirk of the landscape. I went back to my samples. The laughter came again, closer this time. And now I could hear the quality of it more clearly. It wasn't quite right. The pitch was fine, the rhythm normal, but there was something underneath it. An odd resonance, like the sound was coming from somewhere enclosed rather than open air, like it was coming from inside the rock. I set my hammer down and turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint a direction. The laughter seemed to move as I moved, staying just out of sight, just beyond the next rock formation. It circled me, playful and light, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding flat and strange in the stillness. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like a physical pressure on my eardrums. I could hear my own heartbeat, too loud, too fast. I waited, straining to hear anything, footsteps, voices, rustling fabric, anything that would confirm there were actual people nearby. Nothing. Then softly, so softly I almost missed it, I heard singing. Not in English. Not in any language I recognized. It was rhythmic, almost chant-like, with a melody that repeated in short, circular phrases. The voices were still children's voices, but now they had a purpose, a focus. They weren't just playing anymore. They were calling something. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I'm a scientist. I believe in observable phenomena, testable hypotheses, rational explanations. But standing there, alone in that remote section of the park, listening to children who couldn't possibly be there sing in a language I'd never heard, every rational part of my brain was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The singing moved closer, not from one direction, from all directions at once, surrounding me in a circle I couldn't see. I turned, looking for the source, and saw nothing but red rock and blue sky and the empty trail behind me. That's when I noticed the handprints. They were on the rock face nearest to me, just above eye level. Small handprints, child-sized, pressed into the surface of the sandstone. At first, I thought they were painted, some kind of ancient or modern pictograph. But as I stepped closer, I realized they weren't painted at all. They were pressed into the rock, not carved, not etched. Pressed, like the stone had been soft clay when the hands touched it. The edges were smooth and rounded, the fingerprints visible in the depressions. I reached out slowly, half expecting them to disappear when I got close, some trick of light and shadow. My fingers touched one of the prints. It was warm, not sun warm, body warm. The rock around it was cool, shaded from direct light, but the handprint itself radiated a gentle, organic heat, like it had just been left there seconds ago. I jerked my hand back and stumbled a step, my pack sliding off one shoulder. The singing grew louder, more insistent, the circular melody repeating faster now, overlapping itself in a way that made my head hurt. The sound wasn't just around me, it was pressing in on me, coming from the ground, the air, the rock itself. Then it stopped. Complete, absolute silence. I stood frozen, heart hammering, staring at the warm handprints on cold stone. The air felt thick, expectant. My pack hung off one shoulder, heavy with sample bags full of rock I'd chipped away from this place. A voice spoke directly into my left ear, so close I felt warm breath on my skin. Put them back. 3 words. A child's voice, soft and clear, speaking perfect English, with no accent, no hesitation. I didn't scream. I didn't jump. My body locked up entirely, every muscle rigid with a fear so primal it bypassed thought entirely. The breath on my neck stayed there, warm and steady, like someone was standing just behind me, waiting. I understood, in that moment, with a clarity I'd never felt before. The samples in my pack weren't mine to take. This place wasn't as indifferent as I'd thought. The rock, the land, whatever lived here, it was aware, and it wanted back what I'd taken. I moved slowly, keeping my hands visible, the way you would around an animal you didn't want to startle. I let the pack slide off my shoulders and lowered it gently to the ground. My hands were shaking as I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out the sample bags one by one. I didn't speak. I didn't apologize. I just carefully set each piece of rock onto the ground exactly where I'd taken it from, lining them up on the exposed bedrock, matching them back to their spots as closely as I could remember. The presence behind me stayed close the entire time. I could feel it. A weight in the air, a warmth at my back that shouldn't be there. The breath on my neck came in soft, steady intervals, patient. When the last sample was out of my pack, placed carefully on the stone, I stood up slowly. Hands still visible. No sudden movements. Then I started walking. Not running. Not scrambling or panicking. Just walking steady and deliberate, back toward the trail. I kept my pace even, my breathing controlled. I didn't look back. The walk out should have taken maybe 30 minutes. It felt like hours. The air around me changed as I moved, thickening and thinning in waves, like something massive was moving just out of sight, pacing me through the rock. The pressure in my ears pulsed, a rhythmic throb that matched no heartbeat I could name. The smell of the desert, dust and sage and dry stone, mixed with something else, something faintly sweet and organic, like wild honey or overripe fruit. I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, eyes on the trail ahead. The handprints I'd seen stayed in my peripheral vision, appearing on rocks I passed, small and warm and watching. I didn't stop to examine them. I didn't acknowledge them. I just walked. The children's laughter started again, softer now, receding behind me. Not angry, not threatening, just letting me go. It wasn't until I reached the parking lot and saw my car exactly where I'd left it that I allowed myself to stop. I leaned against the driver's side door, legs shaking, and took a long, shuddering breath. The air here was normal. The pressure was gone. The silence was just regular silence, empty and indifferent. I got in the car and drove away without looking back at the trail. 2 weeks later, my thesis advisor asked about the tower arch samples. I told him I hadn't been able to collect anything usable, that the exposure wasn't as good as I'd hoped. He suggested I go back with him, try a different section. I said I'd think about it. Instead, I went to the university library and started researching the Klondike Bluffs area. History, archaeology, indigenous land use. It didn't take long to find references. The area around Tower Arch had been considered sacred by several native tribes, used for ceremonies and burials. The rock formations were seen as inhabited, alive in ways that Western geology doesn't have language for. I also found a note in a 1930s survey report buried in a footnote. Local guides refused to approach the tall arch formation, claimed to hear voices of children in the stone. I changed my thesis topic after that, switched to something that didn't require fieldwork in arches. My advisor was disappointed, but he didn't push. I finished my degree a year later and took a position in a lab, working with samples other people collected. I still think about that day sometimes. The handprints in the stone, the breath on my neck, the way the children's voices circled me, patient and insistent until I gave back what I'd taken. I don't take rocks from the desert anymore. And when I drive past arches on my way to conferences or family visits, I keep my eyes on the road and my windows rolled up tight. Because I know now that some places aren't just geology. Some places remember, and some places don't forgive. If you made it this far, you're braver than most. These aren't just stories. They're warnings, carved into red rock and whispered in empty canyons. If you've ever felt like something was watching you from the desert, trust that instinct. And if you found this unsettling, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to Haunted Fears, and share this with someone who thinks they're brave enough to hike these trails alone. Because out there in Utah's red rock country, you're never really alone. Welcome to the Haunted Fears family. Stay safe out there, or don't. The desert doesn't care either way.
This story, including the research script and editing, was completely created by me. Thank you for supporting original content.